Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
Welcome back to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. One trend we've been seeing is with the low commodity prices the last year or so, we've seen an increase in the amount of on-farm storage capacity across Ohio. And storing grain over the winter and into spring does take proper management to maintain quality and keep it in condition. Unfortunately for some of us, 2019 is the gift that keeps on giving, and the storage situation is further complicated with high moisture, damaged, or even low test weight grain going into bins. To help you better manage your grain and have a strategy going into this winter, we're lucky to have Dr. Hellevang joining us to share some valuable insight on managing stored grain. Welcome.
Welcome from North Dakota. Just to give you a little background on my experience in the grain drying and storage area, I've got not only my academic degrees in agricultural and biosystems engineering, but have been working as an extension engineer, providing education and technical assistance related to grain drying and storage since 1980. And my geographic area that I work in continues to expand. So pretty much today it's across the northern grain producing region of our country. So get the opportunity to interact with farmers and grain storage managers across the region.
That's excellent. We actually were lucky enough to have you join us for a webinar a few weeks ago. And so that information was so valuable. I thought it was important that we also share it through this medium. So after the podcast, if you are curious to learn more, we will include a link to that webinar below. But to start us off, would you give us some idea of what the best practices would be for storing grain?
Well, the storage recommendations really haven't changed much over the at least recent past. Grain stores best if it's dry and cool, and so that's the goal. Many years we end up storing grain at a higher moisture content, at least for the winter months, and that works very well as long as we can keep that stored grain cold. It's best to remove the peak out of the grain bin and those central core fines that tend to accumulate in the center of the bin. Most farmers that I visit with usually will fill the bin to the peak and then come back later and core that bin by removing a couple, 3 loads, and that really does make a difference in the storage of that grain.
So is there a recommended amount of grain that needs to be removed to get a proper core?
Typically, it's going to vary depending on the bin size. The goal is to get nearly a flat top surface, or as we're unloading from most grain bins today, we're taking out of a center unloading sump in the bottom of the bin, and we'll end up with a slightly inverted cone. Whatever the required number of loads or quantity is to level that bin and maybe get a little bit of an inverted cone in the center of the bin.
So one thing is, not a lot of grain has been moving. If they don't have enough loads to deliver to get that correct core, is there anything else they can do?
Well, certainly we'll want to run the aeration fan, and that will cool the grain mass. The primary reason for removing the fines out of the center of the bin and that peak is that the air takes the path of least resistance. And so if we're not able to core the bin, we'll tend to have the air go around that central core of fines, which frequently is at a higher moisture content than the rest of the grain. And then also it'll bypass that middle portion of the bin because that's where we have the greatest depth. So if we can't core the bin, I guess just monitor that center part much more than you would the rest of the bin, and ideally try to core the bin as soon as we can.
So getting the moisture and temperature down are really critical. What are your recommendations for using a fan to dry and cool stored grain?
Well, first thing I'll comment on is that there is very little drying that will occur at temperatures below about 40 degrees. It's not, it's a linear relationship, but the colder the air is, the less moisture that will be picked up. And so we really need to think in the wintertime of keeping the grain cool rather than trying to air dry that bin of grain, whether it's corn, soybeans, or whatever type of grain. So operate the aeration fan, cool the grain down to somewhere in the neighborhoods of 30 degrees. And one of the questions that I frequently get is, how long does that take? And it varies depending on the quantity of airflow, but certainly we don't need to leave the fan run for weeks. Typically, we're looking at maybe 3-4 days of fan time to cool a bin of grain. And then we just monitor that grain, checking it probably about every 2 weeks until we are able to dry it.
So when you're thinking about turning on your fans, what types of weather conditions are the best days to do that?
We'll try to pick days when we have relatively dry air going through the grain. Actually, outside humidity is not that critical as long as we stay away from fog, rain, snow, days when we know that we have extremely wet air. Certainly don't run the fan during those time frames. But whether the relative humidity is 50% or 90% really isn't that important if we're running the fan just to cool that stored grain.
Yeah, that's interesting. And is that mainly because, as you mentioned, getting it cooler is more important than actually drying the grain? So we're really not necessarily removing moisture as much as getting that temperature down quickly.
That's right. Once we're looking at winter conditions, we could run the fan for a long, long time, and I mean weeks, and accomplish virtually no drying. And so the goal really needs to be, or focus needs to be, on running the fan to change the grain temperature. And whenever we're cooling grain, actually we'll frequently see a slight moisture reduction. And so the focus should be getting the grain temperature down to roughly that 30 degrees, doing it when we have, relatively nice outdoor weather conditions, but we typically don't need to be real concerned about what the humidity level is.
So we've got a lot more soybeans in storage than we typically would store in the past. In what ways are the recommendations for managing soybeans in a bin different from corn?
They really aren't that different. Storage of soybeans is going to be very much the same as the storage of corn. Keep it cool, look at the moisture contents. This time of the year, unless we start getting days where we're at 60, 70 degrees, then we start being concerned about managing the stored grain differently. But during the winter months, it's going to be the same. We just might be looking at, soybeans being at 15% and corn at 17, 18%. But the way we treat it is going to be the same. Just run the aeration fans and keep it cool.
So what are the top concerns with stored grain, and what should we look for when we're checking the bins?
Well, primarily, we'll be looking for any kind of deterioration. So The typical ones are mold growth. You might see, if the temperatures are warm, insect infestations. But if we're keeping the grain cool, temperatures down near 30 degrees, the insects will be dormant or sleeping at that point. And if we're looking at warmer temperatures, then we start talking about grain respiration. But again, at those cold temperatures, that grain is essentially in a refrigerator, and so it's basically just monitoring temperature, kind of watching to see is there any changes that are taking place. And with soybeans, it would be the same thing. With corn, we're essentially looking at starch. With soybeans, we're looking both at starch and oils. But the way we're managing them, what we're looking for is any change in temperature, any mold growth, any typical kinds of storage problems that would be occurring.
So is there a amount of temperature change that, would send up a red flag that maybe it's not due to a fluctuation in ambient temperature and that could be due to spoilage?
Well, really, once we've cooled the grain down to 30 degrees, even with warmer outdoor temperatures, it's only going to be the grain that is next to the bin wall that's going to be affected. And so monitoring the grain temperature, it should be staying very close to that 30 degrees. Look for patterns, like you said, if the temperature starts increasing and we're at 35 degrees one time when we check it, the next time most of the sensors are showing 40 degrees. That's an indication to us that something is going on, and we are going to need to probably run the aeration fans, cool it back down again. So there's not a specific temperature that we would be looking at, but a continuing trend of warming. And that's generally not going to occur with a few days of warm temperatures, because that's impacting such a small quantity of grain.
So if we do start noticing some signs of spoilage, like that temperature increase, what should we do? Is there any way that we can stop it from continuing to go downhill?
Back to my favorite topic, and that's running the aeration fan. Yes, if we're noticing the temperature trending up during the winter months, the way that we manage that is by running the aeration fan, bringing in the cold outside air and utilizing that to cool the grain mass down. If we're seeing that upward trending, that's a kind of a signal to us that there might be something taking place that we'll need to worry about later. But at this point, we're just monitoring and running the aeration fan to cool it.
So if we're not selling our grain until, say, next summer or closer into the following year's harvest, what are some management strategies for holding that grain through summer?
Well, we'll talk first about moisture, and then we'll start talking about temperature. The moisture content that we can store over winter can be higher because we're able to keep the grain temperature cold. Once we can't keep the grain temperature cold, then the only way to prevent spoilage from occurring or grain deterioration is to dry the grain. The first thing would be to measure the grain moisture content, know what that moisture content is, and then decide how to dry the grain to get it to an acceptable summer storage moisture content. Going through the summer, we're typically looking at lower moisture contents. With corn, ideally down in the 13.5 to 14% moisture range. For soybeans, probably somewhere in the 11 to 12% moisture range, then would be dry enough to store through the summer. So we'll need to really look at getting the grain dry before summer to those lower moisture contents. Temperature comes into play during the spring. As we go from winter to spring, we start seeing more and more days that are warm. And if we have high moisture grain in the bin, we need to look at what is called the allowable storage time and determine how quickly we need to get that grain dry. There's some regions in the country where we're looking at soybeans that might be above 16% moisture being in the bin due to the challenging harvest. Those beans probably will need to go through a high temperature dryer. If we're at 15% moisture or lower, we can probably do some natural air drying, but we'll need to make sure that we've got adequate airflow in order to dry the soybeans before we have deterioration. With corn, we typically have a little more experience at doing spring management, keeping it cool until we can do the drying. Once temperatures are getting in the 45 to 50 degree average temperature, then we can air dry corn as long as we have that 1 CFM per bushel airflow rate, and as long as we're looking at moisture contents under about 20% moisture. The warmer it is outside, the more airflow that we need to run through the grain to get it dry. So as we go into the spring, we really need to start doing a lot more planning as to how are we going to dry it, when do we need to dry it, keep it cool as long as we can, but we'll need to know a lot more about that stored grain and getting it into condition for summer storage.
That's a great point that you bring up, that the longer you plan on keeping this grain, the better of a plan you're going to need to have in place to be successful at keeping it in condition. This isn't one of those things you just cross your fingers and hope it works out. If you are truly wanting to hold your grain and keep it in condition, having that plan and being intentional about how you go about it is going to help a lot.
Very, very true. We get by with a lot of things storing our grain over winter, but as we start getting into the warmer spring months, then we need to make sure that we have the drying and storage expertise to maintain that quality. Make sure that if we don't have the expertise, that we're finding that expertise so that we can keep the quality of that stored grain.
So if you're creating that plan, you know you're going to be storing the grain for a while and you need to drop the moisture down. When do you recommend that drying taking place? Is it in the spring or as going into the bin during harvest or sometime in winter?
I'm chuckling as I start trying to answer that question because each situation is going to be different. If we're harvesting corn, we can harvest corn at moisture contents of 18, 19, 20% moisture, store it over winter. And if we're set up for natural air drying, we'll start that natural air drying in the spring, probably when temperatures are averaging above 40 degrees. And as long as we have that 1 CFM per bushel airflow rate, everything will dry down to the appropriate storage moisture content and we'll have success. If we don't have adequate airflow, then we will only get part of the bin dry before it starts spoiling. At that point, if we have a bin and we're only at a half CFM per bushel because of limited fan capacity, then we really need to be planning on removing that corn and running it through the high temperature dryer. Ideally, we could do it in the fall, but there's nothing wrong with waiting and doing it in February. In both cases, we're going to be successful at harvesting, storing our grain, and maintaining the quality.
So one other factor that's really complicating grain storage this winter and spring are the seasonal conditions we had in 2019. For folks that have low quality grain that was already low quality going into the bin, is there anything additional that you can recommend to help them?
Well, the big thing to remember with lower quality grain, whether it's light test weight or a number of factors, that corn is going to have a much shorter storage life. If we typically store our corn until July, if we have corn that has a lower quality, let's say light test weight corn, it might be at 52-pound test weight. That corn may be more challenging to safely store into July. One of the things that can be done to enhance the probability of success is to dry it to a little lower moisture content. I know a number of farmers that get by storing corn till July and staying with a 15% moisture content. If we have low quality corn, I would not try to do that same thing with that low quality corn. I would be wanting to have it at less than 14% moisture if there's the potential of storing it into the summer. The recommended storage practice going through the summer is to try to keep that stored grain as cool as we can, as long as we can. That would be much more important on low quality grain than on good quality grain. So this year with low quality grain, making sure that it's dried to a little lower moisture content, making sure that we're keeping that stored grain as close as we can to that 35 to 40 degree temperature as long as we can, become much more important.
That's great advice. And then too, to try to prioritize when you are ready to deliver grain, knowing what grain should go first and the grain that you're planning on holding, giving yourself the best chance to have grain that has the ability to keep in condition.
You mentioned monitoring the temperature. So are there some useful technologies to assist with that, as well as overall managing your stored grain?
Yes, I'm a strong supporter of using what is frequently called temperature cables in the stored grain so that we can monitor the temperature at a number of locations within that bin. There's different technology that is used as far as types of sensors. I don't have a preference one versus the other, but if we're looking at 20 to 40 feet of stored grain, there's no way that we can monitor that temperature without some type of temperature cables. I recommend putting one in the southern portion of the bin, one towards the middle of the bin as a minimum, and that then allows us to have at least some idea of what the temperature is at different locations within the grain mass. And I think that's critical that we utilize that technology to better manage the stored grain. There are also fan controllers that are measuring outside temperature and turning fans on and off. They have their place. I'm not as supportive of needing that kind of assistance with our storage management. I'm really advocating the temperature sensors and then making sure that we have a storage manager that understands grain storage and the expertise to manage that system. Even if we do have a fan controller, those systems need to be observed, and we need to make sure that they're doing what we as an experienced manager think needs to be done. And then I don't overlook the human aspect of just smelling the grain, looking into the bin, looking for any indications of problems. That too becomes a very important sensor to allow us to manage that stored grain.
This has been a lot of great information. Do you have any resources available for farmers that are either looking to build a new system or update, or maybe just some information to help them with their decision making with their grain storage?
Yes, there's some of my information available on the internet, on the web. Tell people just do a search for NDSU or North Dakota State University grain drying and storage, and that's the easiest way to find my website. There are a couple of other universities that have their resources available online. If a person's looking for more information, I recommend looking at what is referred to as the Midwest Plan Service. There's a publication there on planning, grain drying, handling, and storage systems, MWPS 13, that is a good overview of the different factors that a person needs to look at. If one is looking for aeration design and management type information, there's two different publications also available through the Midwest Plan Service, which is a regional effort of agricultural engineers across the north central region. One of those references is strictly on designing aeration systems for dry grain storage, and another one is what we call an AED, or Ag Engineering Digest, on grain storage management. So there are a number of resources available, starting, of course, with my website.
I just want to add one more reminder about the webinar. It is available at go.osu.edu/storedgrain, and we'll include that link in the description. It goes into a lot more depth with slides included, with a lot of the information that we touched on in this podcast. And so with that, we'd like to thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.